Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you all, and a real pleasure to mark with Shahed the publication of this beautiful new book, which I hope you've all bought. And before Shahed comes onto the stage, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on Ellis's introductions and try to give some sense of where Shahed and I are coming from in having this conversation together. So Shahed was born and grew up in southeast London, where his mother, a GP in Woolwich, started the first mosque in Catford in a house conversion in the 80s, which has now grown to become the Lewisham Mosque. And his parents came to the UK from Hyderabad in the late 50s. Shahed then studied architecture at King's University in the 90s, where probably, I guess, unusually, at that moment, he was encouraged to think about race and the post-colonial in relation to architecture. And then after his studies, he spent some time in Bosnia, where he worked for a small aid organization that was running healthcare and aid services, and then briefly in an architecture practice in Sarajevo. And working in that post-war environment, saw a kind of pluralism in the history of Muslim communities in Europe. And on returning, and partly inspired by these Balkan experiences, took an MA in social anthropology at SOAS, and that in turn gave him the kind of analytical skills to research and write on the mosque in Britain, which he started working on formally for Historic England, presumably English Heritage at that point. That really dates it, in 2010. And alongside this, he was designing, as we're going to see, mosque projects the length and breadth of the country. And I think that part of Shahed's achievement, both in this book and also in the comprehensive architectural history of the British Mosque, to which Ellis alluded, is his incredibly thoughtful and open-minded approach to spatial design or spatial configuration, especially in adapted spaces where architecture with a capital A might be hard to find, and indeed where fixtures, fittings, furnishings sit, I think, very squarely, in some cases, against what we might call conventional taste. We can problematize some of these ideas over the course of the evening. For my part, I suppose I'm interested in architectural histories that engage in the post-colonial and the decolonial. In another world, and according to the wishes of my late grandfather, I would have been called Abdul Rahim. We come from a Yoruba Muslim family, unusually. And I suppose what has been genuinely very moving and certainly thought-provoking for me, engaging in Shahed's work for this evening, is kind of how alienated I feel from that part of my heritage, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to explore it in this, I hope, very relaxed forum. So the aim is to be as informal and discursive as possible this evening, but I did just want to tee up that from Shahed and my conversations about this evening, we wanted to make sure that everybody felt suitably familiar with the subject matter and its nuances. And so for this reason, we're going to loosely mimic the structure of the book, which certainly I read in terms of two halves. The first, which is full of kind of rich analysis and historical material, and some very surprising and fascinating material at that. And then the second half, which is more propositional, bravely so, I think, and it leaves the reader, certainly left me, bursting with ideas about what might be possible in the present moment and indeed beyond. And then the texts are bridged by beautifully reproduced photographs that amount to something like a visual gazetteer, but which also filter Shahed's textual analysis, I think, through the lens of his camera. So Shahed's going to speak for about a quarter of an hour about the basic typology of the mosque and its specific spatial manifestations in Britain from the late 19th to the late 20th centuries. Then I thought we would have a pause of a kind in which we, and I mean you as much as me, can ask just clarificatory questions or offer more comment than comments on matters of fact, though, if possible, just so that everybody feels that we are sharing enough of a kind of basic knowledge to then shift gear for the second half, where Shahed will bring forward some of this really interesting propositional thinking on folk architecture and indeed problematizing the multicultural minaret. And so, without further ado, I will ask Shahed to give that first part of the talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, all of you, for being here, firstly. And thanks, a huge amount of thanks for that incredibly generous introduction and breakdown of the plan for the evening, so I don't have to go over that and I can sort of launch straight in. And also a huge thank you to Ellis and the Architecture Foundation for actually jumping at the offer of coming to do this talk here. I hardly finished telling him about this book, and Ellis had already arranged everything, so much appreciated. So I'm just going to launch straight in. As Neal said, first section is going to be following the first section of the book, which is two chapters, the first two chapters of the book, which basically condense the architectural narrative of the mosque in Britain as I have conceived it, explored it, researched it, and written about it. And then the second two chapters, which will look more polemically at what we'll sort of unpack in the first, but also look more at the kind of conflict between myself as a designer of mosques and as a researcher. So that kind of tension that exists within myself between researching and designing. So, a mosque in its most elemental form is a wall or an axis marked on the floor, not necessarily even a building, to enable prayer in congregation towards the Kaaba in Mecca. The Kaaba being a cubic structure which is a symbolic representation of God's presence and unity. I should also say that these are extracts from the book, some of them slightly tweaked to make them work, as they're kind of taken out of the text, but it's a kind of reading of the book as well. The mosque as a building, therefore, is simply a prayer hall in which rows of worshippers can stand behind an imam, face the Kaaba, and perform the prayer. Beyond this simple program, all other manifestations of the mosque are cultural and symbolic. The first mosque was established by the Prophet Muhammad when he migrated with some followers from Mecca to Medina in 622. It was a place of congregational prayer, administration, and the Prophet's house. Arranged as a large open prayer area with living quarters along two perimeter walls, it demonstrated the architecture of the mosque as one of utmost simplicity and served as a point of departure for all subsequent Islamic religious buildings. Over the centuries, from this simplest of enclosures, a series of architectural elements became added on to the building type, namely the dome, minaret, pointed arch, mihrab, which is the niche marking the prayer, the place for the imam leading the prayer, and the minbar, which is essentially the pulpit. Each element had a historical origin and in some cases had been transferred, and then it became adapted and evolved from other religious architectures. So it became kind of adapted and brought into mosque architecture, kind of incorporated. The first mosque in Britain was established in 1889. It was created through the adaptation and extension of a terraced house in Liverpool by local lawyer Abdullah William Quilliam, an Englishman who converted to Islam after his travels in Morocco in the 1880s. He started his congregation in 1887 with a handful of English converts meeting in a nearby rented flat. And then they moved to the house, which became the dedicated premises of the mosque. This template of the mosque as a user-led and incrementally established place through the adaptation of an existing building was to become the defining characteristic of this new religious typology in Britain. The earliest built mosque was in Woking in 1889, in a Victorian Orientalist style. It's a kind of Orientalist fantasy of an exotic culture, presenting a familiar image of the East, seen across architecture and visual culture of the time, of that late Victorian period. Between 1929 and 1990, there's 6 decades which serve as the kind of foundational history of the mosque in Britain. It's the period in which the mosque went from being a rare and somewhat exotic curiosity to being an ubiquitous building type across towns and cities of the country, numbering in the hundreds, if not having already surpassed 1,000 by the end of the 20th century. From the 1960s, migrants, mostly from northern Pakistan, Gujarat, and what was to become Bangladesh, settled across Britain's towns and cities. With growing settled Muslim populations and an increasing British-born generation, the establishment of a religious infrastructure became of central importance to them. Consequently, mosques started to emerge throughout the country, mostly in urban localities of high Muslim density. There was no coordinated effort of mosque building, as there was no central religious body to direct or indeed to channel the funds. So each mosque was the endeavour of the community from which it emerged. They raised funds primarily amongst themselves, and so mosque growth was organic and responsive to those specific community needs. Most mosques of this post-war period were created through the adaptation of existing buildings, as these could be put to mosque use straight away without the complexities and cost of building anew. A large proportion of these early post-war mosques were house mosques created through domestic conversions, and although many mosque communities subsequently moved on to larger premises, many continued in use into the 21st century. As well as the emergence of central mosques in towns and cities across Britain, smaller mosques serving local communities continued to proliferate through the 1980s. These were adapted buildings as well as a growing number of purpose-built examples. In each case, they either attempted a literal replication of traditional Islamic architecture, or they fused Islamic elements with the features of existing buildings. One particular type of adaptation was of former places of worship, in particular churches or synagogues, of which there were some notable examples. In most converted mosques, the application of an Islamic architectural motif onto the existing building was intended to reinscribe and re-signify the building as an Islamic place of worship. Through this replication of Islamic architecture, a connection was being made between the South Asian Muslim community who had established the mosque, in this particular case, and the Muslim historical past. As with mosques created through the adaptation of existing buildings, those that were purpose-built also deployed a language of Islamic signification through the replication of historic Islamic architecture or architectural elements. These replicated Islamic elements, which were usually combined with local materials and styles, such as brickwork, tiled pitch roofs, or dormer windows, can be seen in the mosques of that period. So this 60-year period, up till 1990, saw the emergence of the mosque as this new building type. And it was a process that was going on alongside major historical and social changes that were shaping the nation into its modern form. It's an architectural history that's corollary to and a direct consequence of the process of decolonization across the world since the Second World War. The mosque and its architectural manifestations illustrate the way in which migrant Muslim communities were negotiating their cultural and religious identities in a new country as diasporas. The number of mosques through this period was growing exponentially. So that post-war period, 60s onwards, basically. Most were highly localized and in adapted buildings, though there were also a series of landmark regional mosques emerging in key Muslim conurbations. In this way, a varied and maturing mosque infrastructure was taking shape across the country, laying the foundations for the wave of mosque building that was to come in the next decades from the 90s onwards. Communities which had established mosques as new migrants had now settled down, grown, and were replacing their initial structures with new ones. It could be argued that in this first wave of purpose-built mosques, and in that I'm talking about mosques that were purpose-built from the late 60s. I mean, I think the earliest post-war purpose-built mosque that I could identify was actually in Coventry in the late 50s, 1959, a very hand-built building. And then Preston in 1969. So like really the kind of early post-war purpose-built mosques were starting, and this is from the ground up, we're starting in that period through to about the 90s, so talking about 20 or so years of that first wave. So it could be argued in the first wave, the building type was developing something of its own distinctive architectural style, albeit in an ad hoc and uncoordinated way. In this emerging style, the vernacular architecture of the local townscape was incorporated into the architecture of the mosque and juxtaposed with historic Islamic architectural references to create an amalgamated composition of traditionally Islamic elements merged with local domestic forms. Such mosques were generally built by local Muslim communities who self-funded, designed and built their places of worship. This trend of hybridizing the Islamic with the suburban vernacular continued in mosques through the 90s and into the 2000s, actually, with mosque numbers steadily increasing over this period. Even in places where mosques sought considerable scale and expression, the overlapping of cultural references continued. Through a growing number of mosques through the 80s and into the 90s, though a growing number of mosques through the 80s and into the 90s adopted this stylistic approach of hybridity, it could be said that an indigenous Islamic architectural style was emerging in Britain through this kind of hybridization. And this style, in a way, we could describe it as a type of creolization in which an architectural language was characterized by the coming together of these different cultural traditions. The 90s, however, also saw the emergence of another manifesto for Islamic architecture in Britain. It came in the form of the Bilal Mosque in Leeds, Yorkshire, designed by an Iraqi-born British structural engineer Atba al-Samurai. This building represents a juncture. It was conceived as a more authentic representation of global and traditional Islamic history and culture. The mosque is a marked shift from the architectural hybridity of the mosques that had preceded it. In its design, any reference to the local architectural style or materials, the Victorian back-to-back terraced houses of inner-city Leeds, is omitted, and instead a wholly distinct Islamic architectural language is presented. The building, therefore, represents a move away from any attempt to link the mosque visually or materially to local architectural idioms, seeking instead a more complete and unambiguous transnational Muslim identity through the replication of historic Islamic form. These historicist mosques from the 2000s attempted to fulfill a role of reconnecting their users to a historical Islamic past in more specific architectural ways. The 2010 Jamia Mosque in Leicester draws its Islamic references more overtly from the medieval Fatimid or Mamluk mosques of Cairo. The mosque has been formed by extending and recladding former industrial premises, with the decorated panelling, ornamental elements, minarets and dome being formed from glass-reinforced plastic. There is a historical disconnection going on here, since the mosque was founded by and mostly serves a Gujarati Indian community with no ties to medieval Egypt. This indicates that diasporic Muslim communities were becoming satisfied with a pan-Islamic identity, which can range temporally and geographically across the Muslim world. This represents a delinking of diaspora communities from their specific historical trajectories and their absorption into a broader global Muslim community. So what does this historicist turn say about Muslim life and imagination in Britain, and how can or should this largely immigrant experience be responded to architecturally? Part 2. So I'm going to try and go through some... So part 2, the second 2 chapters in the book, are based on my own sort of experience of designing mosques, and combining that with the kind of research of looking at and unpacking and exploring sort of the history of mosque architecture and working with communities as a sort of, I suppose it's as an anthropologist, but also as a designer, and the tension or the conflict that comes about between being both. In that, as an anthropologist, you don't have to necessarily make a commitment, but as a designer, you do. And this raises a whole series of issues. So, and again, these are readings, extracts from the book. Criticism of the aesthetics of the diasporic Muslim mosque in Britain has become fairly widespread. It has been variously described as the architectural homesickness, imitation culture, or as, and I'm quoting here, a kind of barbarian Orientalism and garish syncretism designed by underpaid jobbing architects who are dimly recalling Muslim culture in the subcontinent. This is a quote from Abdul Hakim Murad, who is the client for the Cambridge Mosque, which you might know about. It was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize at Marks Barfield Mosque 2 years ago, perhaps. In 2002, the architectural critic Jonathan Glancy wrote in The Guardian, "Why are there no great British mosques?" He considered Woking Mosque the only real expression of a credible Muslim architecture in this country, with the mosques that followed failing to reach any criteria of architectural merit, often being, in his words, no more than brick boxes with minarets and domes applied like afterthoughts. Why are the new mosques so determinedly glum? Was his question. When the Frederick Gibbard-designed Regent's Park Mosque was completed in 1977, the Architectural Review ran a feature on it that made an assertion that Muslim architecture was in a state of stasis when compared with progressive Christian church design. In a disparaging and, it has to be said, somewhat racist editorial, the Architectural Review said, and it's worth, I think it's worth me kind of like reading a decent section of this review, which is in the book as well. So this is the editorial. The Muslim religion is based on an acceptance of a set of eternal truths. 1,000 and more years ago, the acceptors of these truths worked out a set of architectural forms which embodied them, and this was it. There was no motive to depart from these forms. By contrast, in Christianity, an unchanging divine truth enters into a continuous dialogue with the changing secular world, and this gives rise to a culture which is not static but evolving. As a consequence, the Christian tradition was able to accept modern architecture. The Islamic tradition could not do this, and there could be no corresponding dialogue. The Islamic tradition could not do this, and there could be no corresponding dialogue. Its forms had to survive intact and be tacked onto buildings shaped by a different approach. It is this difference in cultural attitude which gives modern Islam such a flimsy look in Western eyes, and why it is so difficult for us to shake off associations with Turkish delight and Alibaba. Don't know if you've ever come across that in the AR, but now, the flaw with this view of Islamic architecture is that it is founded on a set of this assertion that it's founded on a set of original forms which are authentically embedded in a religious truth. Rather, what history shows is that Islamic architecture has been a continuous series of adaptations and inventions across time and place, and it has been informed by the specifics of the particular cultures it engaged with, rather than by an ahistorical religious understanding that was tied to fixed architectural forms. So these debates around and critiques of the purpose-built mosque emerging in Britain in significant numbers from the late 70s onwards suggests that they are trapped in a perseverating condition where a repertoire of historical signs are repeated in ever more ad hoc convoluted forms. The resulting architecture is critiqued as reinforcing a sense of alienation and otherness, for the Muslim diaspora and of feeding the fears and anxiety felt by those who oppose the growing visibility of the Muslim presence. However, it can be argued that the Muslim diaspora needs and is reliant upon the very simplicity and recognizability of these signs to be able to self-identify as a Muslim community and feel that their place of worship is properly and fully Muslim. The question then arises, is why has diasporic Muslim identity become so reliant on a limited palette of architectural imagery? To start delving into this question, it's worth reflecting on the relationship between the Muslim diaspora and Muslim history more broadly. For Muslim diasporas, how Islamic history is narrated, how it is then consumed, is central to their identity formation. The diasporic historicist mosque emerges as one of the key cultural strategies through which a normative Muslim history is constructed. It is part of a wider diasporic strategy of replicating and reinventing a Muslim social and cultural world that has been dislocated through the colonial and migratory process. The diasporic historicist mosque's role, according to this reading, is to present a stable image of the Islamic past in order to reinstate a normative version of Islamic history in this new place where the Muslim diaspora can pick up from where colonial violence uprooted and relocated it. So as a design professional and a second-generation migrant Muslim, I find myself in something of a perpetual paradox. As a designer, seeing the historicist Islamic architecture of Britain's mosques through the 80s and 90s is problematic. It suggests to me that Muslim diasporas are tied to a literal reading of a mythic Islamic history and are unable to articulate an identity that reflects their contemporary reality. To my design sensibility, these buildings demonstrate a reduction of the complex and heterogeneous history of Islam into a series of simple archetypes, whereby Muslims, through the design of their mosques, are reducing themselves from a complex and multi-layered patchwork of communities into a simple and uncomplicated whole. However, from a perspective of community agency and empowerment, the creation of these mosques in the raw and unschooled vision of their users represents a powerful statement of identity and presence. Their architecture has an added power because of the offence it causes the educated and expert vision through its perceived lack of design narrative. It could be described as a kind of folk architecture, positioned outside of mainstream architectural aesthetics and production. An architectural visual culture which both nourishes and is nourished by, and I quote, potent fantasies about authenticity and purity, mixed into a heady cocktail with the addition of a dash of nostalgia. I find myself both troubled by and in admiration of this single-minded vision, which shows that at least in some degree, through sheer perseverance against the networks of power stacked against them, the subaltern speaks. My own architectural practice started in Bethnal Green in East London in the early 2000s, as a small general practice in a multi-ethnic part of the inner city, serving a largely ethnic minority clientele of small developers, householders, businesses and community organisations. Very soon we were approached by mosques across East London, it being an area with a high Muslim population and historically a migrant landing point. From the outset, I wanted to move away from the historicist turn in UK mosques for the reasons that I've spoken about, and I pursued instead an architecture that I felt could reflect the contemporary Muslim condition, which for me was one of migration, diasporization and hybridity. My understanding of this situation or this context or this description was based on my own lived experience as a second-generation migrant. And so my perception of the diasporic condition was one of continuous and incremental cultural, religious, and identity reconstruction. My design endeavour became for the architecture of the mosque to serve as an instrument through which to reimagine and reconstruct, but not to replicate, historical and cultural trajectories that have been interrupted. For me, the reconstruction of cultural histories and past lives by diasporas is always partial and incomplete, as it can never be a simple reinstatement of the past. The process of reconstructing must instead negotiate between a real and imagined past and a new present, and this negotiation changes both the diaspora and the host. In 2004, I was appointed as architect for a new mosque project in East London. My ambition from the outset was that the new mosque should be a modern building, a contemporary interpretation of traditional Muslim architecture that delivered a new architectural language reflecting a mixture of cultures and traditions. So I sat with the mosque committee on a number of occasions. As I made my case for this architectural vision with drawings and diagrams, the committee chairman, a migrant from Sylhet, thoughtfully turned to me and he softly said, "Brother, we don't want a multicultural minaret like the one at Brick Lane. We want an Islamic minaret." So I thought long and hard about what he could mean by this. It took many years for me to finally write the essay, thanks to my friend Megha here. The design process that followed involved the passing back and forth of design and counter-design between myself as the architect with a vision of Muslim identities in diasporic transition, and the mosque committee, a diasporic Bangladeshi community, with a vision of a clearly locatable and accessible Islamic past. In my proposals, recognizable Islamic motifs were abstracted and applied in fragments combined with the contemporary modernist-inspired architectural form. The mosque committee reviewed these designs and made suggestions as to how they could be made more Islamic through, for example, the introduction of arches along the facade to disrupt my modernizing tendencies. This went on. To and fro, and the full story is in the book. And we did eventually come to an agreed design. But to think further on the multicultural minaret, was the chairman's rejection of the multicultural minaret, and instead an assertion of his Islamic identity, an act of self-determination and self-identification, or was it an act of segregation or separatism, as it might also seem? According to the anthropologist James Clifford, one of the characteristics of diasporas is that they believe they are not and perhaps cannot be fully accepted in their host country, and that while diaspora consciousness is constituted negatively through the experience of discrimination and exclusion, it is also produced positively through identification with world historical, cultural, and political forces, which can offer a sense of attachment elsewhere through transnational global connections. The mosque in Britain can accordingly be understood as a vehicle through which diaspora communities attempt to identify and connect with historical and global Muslim cultures, placing them in a cultural space that is simultaneously historic and contemporary. Multiculturalism, as a culturally hegemonic project of managing diverse societies, can and has been critiqued as an assimilationist strategy where the good multicultural citizen subsumes their identity and politics into a government and media constructed and culturally dominant definition of the multicultural Britain. The multicultural minaret, therefore, becomes a visual symbol of that dominant and totalizing cultural vision which the mosque chairman, in his demand for an Islamic minaret, perhaps instinctively sought to resist. The mosque chairman, through his rejection of the multicultural, is resisting the positioning of himself and his community according to a dominant cultural logic to which he has no access. Instead, the chairman, through his assertion of the Islamic, seeks a distinct identity that he is in control of and by which he would like to be identified. Between the multicultural minaret and the Islamic minaret are a series of overlapping discourses revolving around who is in control of the discursive formations through which post-colonial identities are made and articulated. The Mosque Committee chairman, through his rejection of this dominant architectural agenda, the multicultural minaret, raises the question of whether the Islamic mosque in Britain, marginalised by the artistic academy as being of no value in architectural culture, actually represents one of the most successful and determined forms of cultural resistance to a neo-colonial hegemony, that being the continuous creation and control of permanent minorities. If this is true, then the Islamic mosque is in fact one of the most politicised and rebellious forms of architecture in late 20th century Britain. That's the end of part 2. Thank you very much.